I want you to stop whatever you are doing right now, because what I am about to tell you in the next 28 minutes could be the difference between you walking out of a grocery store next week and being wheeled out of an emergency room. I am Dr. Waleem Lee, a practicing cardiologist with over 22 years of clinical experience, and I have sat across from more than 6,000 patients in my career, men and women who were otherwise healthy, who exercised, who thought they were making reasonable choices, and I have had to deliver the devastating news that their hearts were failing them. And when I began tracing the common threads in their diets, one food group showed up with alarming and consistent frequency. Not red meat, not sugar, not alcohol, cheese. Specifically, 4 types of cheese that the food industry has spent billions of dollars convincing people over 60 are perfectly fine, even beneficial. They are not. And today I am going to give you the science, the biochemistry, the clinical data, and the hard truth that no one in a lab coat has had the courage to say plainly enough. Before we get into the 4 cheeses, I need you to understand something foundational about what happens to the human cardiovascular system after the age of 60, because the risk is not the same as it was when you were 40. Your arteries have been collecting microscopic damage for decades. The endothelium, that single delicate layer of cells lining the interior of every blood vessel in your body, has been quietly accumulating inflammatory signals, oxidative stress, and lipid deposits since your 30s. By the time you are 60, those deposits, which we call atherosclerotic plaques, are not just present, they are vulnerable. They are what cardiologists call unstable plaques, meaning they sit like landmines in the walls of your coronary arteries, and the right dietary trigger can cause them to rupture, initiating a clot, blocking blood flow to the heart muscle, and triggering a myocardial infarction, a heart attack, within minutes. This is not theoretical. This is the mechanism I watch kill people, and it is the reason that what you eat after 60 carries consequences it simply did not carry at 50. Now, why is cheese particularly relevant to this conversation? The answer lies in the convergence of 3 specific biological factors that cheese delivers in concentrated form: saturated fat, sodium, and something most people have never heard of called tyramine. When these 3 compounds enter an aging cardiovascular system simultaneously, they create a cascade of effects that is genuinely dangerous. Saturated fat raises LDL cholesterol, the type that embeds itself in arterial walls. Sodium drives up blood pressure by increasing fluid retention and causing arterial stiffness. Tyramine, a naturally occurring compound that forms when proteins in food break down during aging and fermentation, triggers the release of norepinephrine, which causes a sudden and dramatic spike in blood pressure. In younger individuals, the body compensates quickly. In someone over 60, whose arteries are already stiff and whose baroreceptors, the pressure sensors in the blood vessels, are less responsive, that spike is far more dangerous. The 3 factors combined do not simply add, they multiply. This is what makes the specific cheeses I am about to describe categorically different from the general warning to limit dairy. Let us begin with the first cheese, and I want you to brace yourself because this one is going to surprise many of you. Aged Gouda. I know what you are thinking. Gouda is European, it is artisanal, health magazines have practically romanticized it as a sophisticated cheese, and you have seen it on charcuterie boards at every upscale gathering for the past decade. But here is the clinical reality. Aged Gouda, specifically varieties aged 12 months or longer, which are the ones most commonly marketed as premium, contains tyramine levels that range between 516 and 952 milligrams per 100 grams of cheese. To give you context, the threshold at which tyramine begins to cause dangerous hypertensive responses in susceptible individuals, and after 60, most of you are susceptible whether you have been diagnosed or not, is approximately 6 milligrams per serving. A standard portion of aged Gouda, which most people define as somewhere between 30 and 50 grams, can deliver between 150 and 475 milligrams of tyramine. That is not a marginal overage. That is potentially 80 times the threshold for a dangerous vascular response. And this is happening in an artery that may already have a vulnerable plaque sitting in it, waiting for exactly this kind of pressure spike to rupture. I have had patients who took medications called MAO inhibitors for depression or Parkinson's disease eat aged Gouda and experience what we call a hypertensive crisis, blood pressure shooting above 180 over 120 within 30 minutes of eating. but I am increasingly seeing near-crisis spikes in patients who are not on any medication at all, simply because of the degree of arterial stiffening that comes with age. The food industry knows the tyramine data. They simply choose not to put it on the label, because there is no regulatory requirement to do so. Beyond tyramine, aged Gouda carries a saturated fat burden that deserves its own conversation. 100 grams of aged Gouda contains approximately 22 grams of saturated fat. The American Heart Association recommends keeping saturated fat to no more than 5 to 6% of total daily calories. For the average person consuming 2,000 calories, that is roughly 11 to 13 grams per day. A modest portion of aged Gouda gets you close to or past that entire daily limit in a single snack. And saturated fat does not simply raise LDL in a straightforward linear way. It alters the particle size of LDL cholesterol, producing smaller, denser particles that are far more capable of penetrating the arterial wall and contributing to plaque formation. This is the nuance the general public never hears. It is not just how much LDL you have, it is the structure of the LDL particles. Aged Gouda promotes the dangerous small dense LDL phenotype. Combined with its tyramine load, this cheese is cardiovascular dynamite for anyone over 60, regardless of whether they have been previously diagnosed with heart disease. The second cheese, and this one I expect will generate more argument because it has been relentlessly promoted as a health food, is processed cheese spreads. I am talking specifically about the kind sold in jars and tubs, the kind marketed with language like made with real cheese, or contains calcium, or heart healthy because it's low in fat. The low-fat versions are in some ways actually worse. Here is why. When manufacturers strip fat from cheese, the product loses palatability. It tastes flat, has an unpleasant texture, and people won't buy it. So they compensate with sodium and with emulsifying agents, the most common of which are sodium phosphate, sodium citrate, and sodium polyphosphate. These compounds serve a useful industrial purpose. They keep the cheese smooth and prevent separation, but they are devastating to vascular health in aging populations. Phosphate additives, when absorbed in the gut, contribute to elevated serum phosphate levels, and elevated serum phosphate is associated with vascular calcification, the literal hardening and calcification of arterial walls. A study published in the Journal of the American Society of Nephrology found that individuals in the highest quartile of phosphate additive consumption had a 27% higher rate of cardiovascular events compared to those in the lowest quartile. And unlike naturally occurring phosphates found in whole foods, which are poorly absorbed, typically only 40 to 60% of dietary phosphate is absorbed from natural sources, phosphate additives have an absorption rate of nearly 90 to 100%. The food industry is essentially injecting vascular calcification accelerants into products labeled as convenient, calcium-containing heart-healthy snacks. And the sodium content of these spreads is staggering. Some popular processed cheese spreads contain between 400 and 700 milligrams of sodium per serving, and the serving sizes listed on the label are laughably small compared to how people actually use these products. Smear that on a few crackers the way a normal human being eats, and you are at 1,200 to 1,400 milligrams of sodium in a snack. For context, the recommendation for adults over 61 is typically to stay under 1,500 milligrams per day for the entire day. This is not food regulation at work. This is deregulation in a jar. What makes processed cheese spreads particularly insidious for the over 60 population specifically is the interaction with blood pressure medications. A significant proportion of people over 60 are on antihypertensives, ACE inhibitors, calcium channel blockers, diuretics. The high sodium load from processed cheese actively counteracts many of these medications. Your cardiologist prescribes you lisinopril to protect your kidneys and lower your blood pressure, and then you have a cheese spread on crackers while watching television, and the sodium negates a meaningful portion of the medication's effect for the next several hours. This is not speculation. I've seen this pattern clinically. Patients whose blood pressure is well controlled in my office, but persistently elevated on their home monitors. When we dig into dietary logs, processed cheese appears repeatedly. The medication is doing its job. The food is undoing it. The third cheese is one that millions of people have been told is actually good for their hearts. Blue cheese. And I understand why this misconception exists. There has been a body of research on the fermentation-derived compounds in blue cheese, particularly a compound called spermidine, which has been associated with cellular autophagy and longevity in laboratory settings. The food press ran with this, and blue cheese suddenly acquired a health halo. What the breathless headlines failed to mention was that the concentrations of spermidine needed to produce measurable autophagy effects in human studies are far higher than what you get from a serving of blue cheese, and that the other compounds present in blue cheese, the sodium, the tyramine from the Penicillium roqueforti mold cultures, and the saturated fat, collectively create a risk profile that vastly outweighs any speculative benefit from spermidine. Let me give you the numbers. Blue cheese contains between 270 and 440 milligrams of tyramine per 100 grams, still in the dangerous range for people over 60, though lower than aged Gouda. Its sodium content ranges from 580 to over 1,200 milligrams per 100 grams, depending on the variety, with Roquefort at the extreme upper end. And its saturated fat content averages around 19 grams per 100 grams. But what makes blue cheese uniquely risky in a way that aged Gouda is not, is the inflammatory potential of its mold-derived compounds. The secondary metabolites produced by Penicillium roqueforti include several compounds that, in susceptible individuals, promote the release of prostaglandins and leukotrienes, inflammatory mediators that directly affect the stability of arterial plaques. Plaque stabilization requires a healthy anti-inflammatory environment in the arterial wall. Blue cheese actively disrupts that environment. The result in the aging cardiovascular system is that vulnerable plaques become more likely to rupture not from a single dramatic event, but from a gradual erosion of the protective fibrous cap that keeps the lipid core of the plaque contained. This is the mechanism behind what we call silent heart attacks, infarctions that occur without the classic crushing chest pain that are more common after 60, more common in women, and more common in individuals with persistent low-grade systemic inflammation. Blue cheese is a potent driver of that inflammation. I want to pause here and address the objection that I know is forming in some of your minds, because I hear it from patients every single week. You're thinking, but Dr. Lee, people in France eat blue cheese and Gouda and all kinds of rich cheese every day, and they seem to have lower rates of heart disease. This is the French paradox, and I want to dismantle it properly rather than dismiss it, because it deserves a real answer. The French paradox, the observation that French people consume relatively high amounts of saturated fat, yet have lower rates of coronary heart disease than Americans, is real as an epidemiological observation. But the conclusions drawn from it have been wildly oversimplified. First, the French population in the studies that gave rise to the French paradox consumed far more antioxidants from fresh vegetables, legumes, and polyphenol-rich wine than the average American. These compounds independently reduce oxidative stress and plaque vulnerability. Second, the French portion sizes for cheese, historically and traditionally, are dramatically smaller than what Americans consider a serving, a thin sliver after a meal, not a block cut from a wedge. Third, and most critically, the French paradox studies were conducted primarily on populations between the ages of 40 and 65. The paradox does not hold in the same way for octogenarians, and the protective effects of whatever cultural dietary factors are at play diminish precisely in the post-60 age range, when arterial stiffness, impaired baroreceptor function, and accumulated plaque burden make the cardiovascular system far more vulnerable to the specific insults that high tyramine, high sodium, high saturated fat cheeses deliver. The French paradox is not an argument for eating blue cheese after 60. It is an argument for eating more polyphenols and smaller portions in the context of an overall diet characterized by freshness and diversity, none of which are features of pulling a wedge of Roquefort out of a plastic wrapper and eating it on crackers. The fourth cheese, and I have saved this one for last because it is perhaps the most counterintuitive and because the risk mechanism is different from the first three, is ricotta. Specifically, commercially produced, full-fat ricotta, and even more specifically, ricotta that has been used in baked preparations like lasagna, stuffed shells, and certain cheesecakes. Now I can already hear the gasps. Ricotta is soft. It is mild. It is often recommended for people on restricted diets because it is lower in sodium than aged cheeses and has a gentler flavor profile. And if you are eating a tablespoon of plain ricotta in isolation, it is not going to kill you. The problem is not ricotta in isolation. The problem is ricotta as it is actually consumed, specifically in high-heat baked preparations, combined with refined carbohydrates in the quantities that traditional Italian-American recipes call for. Let me explain why this combination is specifically catastrophic for people over 60. When full-fat ricotta is baked at temperatures above 175 degrees Celsius for extended periods, as in a lasagna that bakes for 45 to 60 minutes, the whey proteins in the ricotta undergo a process called Maillard reaction and advanced glycation end product formation, or AGE formation. Advanced glycation end products are compounds formed when proteins bond with sugars under heat, and they are deeply problematic for vascular health. AGEs promote endothelial dysfunction, increase oxidative stress in arterial walls, activate inflammatory pathways, and directly stiffen the collagen matrix of blood vessel walls, which is already compromised in the aging cardiovascular system. Dietary AGEs from cooked cheese are absorbed in the gut and enter circulation, where they bind to receptors called RAGE, receptor for advanced glycation end products, which triggers a systemic inflammatory response. A study published in the journal Circulation found that high dietary AGE intake was independently associated with increased carotid intima media thickness, a direct measure of arterial wall thickening that predicts cardiovascular events. The ricotta in your lasagna, once baked, is a concentrated source of dietary AGEs. And because the lasagna is also built on refined pasta, refined carbohydrates that spike blood glucose rapidly, the glucose environment in the bloodstream after eating is elevated at precisely the moment when maximum AGE formation is occurring. Elevated blood glucose accelerates AGE formation both in food being digested and in the tissues of the body itself. The combination creates an internal environment in the arterial wall that is, for someone over 60 with existing plaque, genuinely alarming. There is another dimension to the ricotta risk that is rarely discussed: the calcium-phosphorus interaction. Ricotta is high in calcium, which sounds positive, but when consumed in large quantities alongside the phosphorus-rich pasta and meat in a traditional lasagna, it can disturb the calcium-phosphorus ratio in ways that, paradoxically, contribute to vascular calcification rather than preventing it. The body's management of calcium and phosphorus is a tightly regulated hormonal system involving parathyroid hormone, calcitonin, and fibroblast growth factor 23. When large boluses of both calcium and phosphorus enter the gut simultaneously, as they do in a generous serving of baked ricotta lasagna, the regulatory system can be temporarily overwhelmed, and the excess calcium, rather than being directed to bone, may be deposited in arterial walls. This mechanism is well established in patients with chronic kidney disease who are at extremely high risk of vascular calcification, but emerging research suggests that even in individuals with normal kidney function, repeated large calcium-phosphorus loads from meals like baked ricotta lasagna can contribute meaningfully to arterial calcification over time. After 60, when kidney filtration capacity has naturally declined by somewhere between 30 and 40% compared to peak young adult function, this effect is more pronounced and more dangerous. Now, I want to address what to do with all of this information, because I am not a cardiologist who believes in leaving patients with fear and no path forward. The goal of this conversation is never to make you feel that eating is dangerous or that food is your enemy. Food is medicine when chosen correctly, and at 60 and beyond, your dietary choices have more power over your cardiovascular outcome than almost any other modifiable factor in your life. What I am asking you to do is make those choices with accurate information, rather than the information the food industry wants you to have. If you enjoy cheese, and I understand that many people have deep emotional and cultural connections to certain foods, the research supports that hard, naturally aged cheeses consumed in genuinely small quantities as part of a meal anchored in vegetables, lean proteins, and fiber carry substantially lower risk than the 4 cheeses I have described consumed in typical American portion sizes. A thin slice of genuine Parmigiano Reggiano, not the powdered stuff in a green can which has its own problems, grated over vegetables or a small pasta portion, introduces calcium and some beneficial bioactive peptides without the tyramine load of aged Gouda because the production process is different. The microbial cultures involved, the specific curing conditions, the pH of the cheese, all of these factors affect tyramine production, and Parmigiano Reggiano paradoxically develops lower tyramine concentrations than aged Gouda despite its longer aging period. Similarly, fresh mozzarella, not the low-moisture packaged part skim block, but genuine fresh mozzarella stored in water, has low tyramine, moderate sodium, and has not been subjected to the high heat processing that produces AGEs. These are not perfect foods, but they are meaningfully different in risk profile. What matters most, beyond any individual food choice, is understanding the cumulative inflammatory burden that your diet is either reducing or increasing every single day. Your arteries do not have a reset button. Every meal either pushes toward an environment of inflammation, oxidative stress, and plaque instability, or it pulls toward an environment of endothelial repair, anti-inflammatory signaling, and vascular resilience. The 4 cheeses I have described today, aged Gouda, processed cheese spreads, blue cheese, and baked full-fat ricotta, are consistent, reliable contributors to the wrong environment. And after 60, when the margin for error in your cardiovascular system has narrowed dramatically, eliminating them is not a sacrifice. It is a survival strategy. I want to share with you the case of a patient I will call Richard, 64 years old, former marathon runner, meticulous about his weight and his exercise routine, no family history of heart disease, normal cholesterol on his last blood panel 2 years prior. He came into my office not because he had chest pain, but because his wife insisted after she noticed he seemed occasionally short of breath going upstairs. His stress echocardiogram showed reduced perfusion in the left anterior descending artery territory, a significant finding. A subsequent angiogram revealed 70% stenosis in 2 vessels. He was one bad meal away from a major cardiac event. When I took his dietary history in detail, something many cardiologists do not spend enough time on, his diet was exemplary in almost every respect. He ate lean meats, abundant vegetables, minimal sugar, very little alcohol. One pattern stood out. Every evening, he and his wife had what they called a European cheese board, aged Gouda, blue cheese, sometimes a spreadable processed cheese with crackers. It was their ritual, their moment of sophistication and pleasure after dinner. He had been doing this for approximately 8 years. I am not suggesting that the cheese board caused his atherosclerosis. That is a complex, multifactorial process. But I am telling you, with complete clinical confidence, that the repeated tyramine spikes, the daily sodium surges, and the sustained inflammatory environment created by blue cheese and aged Gouda contributed meaningfully to the progression and instability of his plaques. He is currently managed medically and has agreed to eliminate those cheeses entirely. His inflammatory markers, specifically high-sensitivity C-reactive protein, dropped by 34% in 3 months without any change to his medication regimen. Food is medicine. The wrong food is poison. The conversation about cheese and cardiovascular risk after 60 is not one that gets enough attention in cardiology offices, and I will tell you honestly why. It is complicated and time-consuming to explain. Dietary counseling is poorly reimbursed by insurance, and telling a 65-year-old man that his beloved evening Gouda is killing him is not a message that earns you enthusiastic patient reviews. But I did not go into medicine to be popular. I went into medicine to keep people alive, and if I can stand before you today and give you information that meaningfully reduces your risk of being in an ambulance with a catheter in your groin at 2 a.m, then every difficult conversation is worth it. The biology of aging is not negotiable. The stiffening of your arteries, the decline in your endothelial repair capacity, the progressive accumulation of oxidative damage, these happen, and no supplement, no exercise program, no amount of positive thinking fully reverses them. But the dietary choices you make from this point forward can absolutely influence the pace of that process, the stability of existing plaques, and the inflammatory environment in your blood vessels. The 4 cheeses I have described are not worth the risk. Aged Gouda with its tyramine time bomb, processed cheese spread with its phosphate-mediated vascular calcification and sodium that undoes your blood pressure medication. Blue cheese with its mold-derived inflammatory compounds that quietly erode the protective caps on your arterial plaques. And baked full-fat ricotta with its advanced glycation end products that stiffen your vessels and activate inflammatory cascades in precisely the arterial environment that needs to be protected most. Your heart has been beating for over 60 years without a vacation. It has pumped somewhere between 2 and 3 billion times since you were born, and it asks very little of you in return. Eat with intention, move your body, manage your stress, sleep adequately, and for the love of everything that matters to you, stop taking its resilience for granted. The choices you make at 60, 65, 70 have consequences that manifest quickly because the cardiovascular system at that age has far less reserve capacity to absorb the chronic insults of inflammatory food. A 20-year-old can eat aged Gouda every night and likely suffer no immediate measurable harm because their arteries are elastic, their plaques are minimal or absent, their baroreceptors are sharp, and their endothelium has enormous regenerative capacity. You do not have those advantages anymore, and pretending otherwise, because the cheese tastes good, because it has always been on the dinner table, because a magazine article told you it was fine, is not a luxury your heart can afford. I want to close by saying something that I mean with the full weight of my clinical experience. The people who make the best cardiovascular outcomes in my practice after 60 are not the ones who arrived with the cleanest arteries. Some of them came to me in terrible shape. The people who do best are the ones who, upon learning the truth, act on it without hesitation or negotiation. They do not bargain with their biology. They do not say just weekends or just a little bit. They treat the information I give them with the seriousness it deserves, and they make the change completely and permanently. And those are the patients I see thriving at 75, at 80, at 85, sharp, mobile, independent, present in their families' lives. That is what is on the other side of this conversation. Not deprivation, not joyless eating, a longer, stronger life with a heart that continues to do its job because you gave it the environment it needed to keep doing so. The choice, as it always is in medicine, is yours. But now you have the information to make it honestly.